First, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the indigenous people upon whose ancestral lands our university now stands. I would like to thank Professor Len Lopo and the team in the Center for Policy Research for organizing today's event. I also thank Maxwell staff in Information and Computing Technology for their support, the staff of the Shine Student Center for hosting us, and Syracuse Catering for their help and assistance with today's event. This is a great occasion for Maxwell. It's an opportunity to highlight some of the exciting work that we have happening at Syracuse University and the Maxwell School, and to hear from a world-renowned economist, Chetty, who is doing innovative work to help design more effective policy interventions across government and to improve issues of equality, life expectancy, and economic mobility. It also gives us a very special opportunity to acknowledge the many people who have helped to make this occasion possible. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank someone very special who could not be here today with us, and that's Paul Volcker himself. Chairman Volcker is a member of the Maxwell Advisory Board, and we're honored to have the opportunity to work with him and the Volcker Alliance on important issues of public service. The chairman's enthusiasm for Syracuse University and the Maxwell School is great and deeply appreciated, and his ongoing investment with the Volcker Chair, with this annual lecture, and as a member of the Maxwell Advisory Board is invaluable to the school. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank and pay tribute to Syracuse University Board of Trustee Bob Menschel, a graduate from the class of 1951. Bob is an extraordinary business person, philanthropist, and a great citizen who has contributed in so many ways to Syracuse University through his time and his generosity, and especially in his commitment to the Maxwell School. Bob's remarkable philanthropic support established the Paul Volcker Chair and this wonderful annual program that we've benefited from so much. Behavioral economics is a passion for Bob. In practice, he's someone who's had a distinguished career, and he's focused extensively on markets and the economy over the long term and how they affect individuals everywhere within the United States. We cannot thank Bob enough for the lasting impact that his support has meant to Syracuse University and to the Maxwell School. Consistent with Mr. Menschel's interests, Maxwell has a deep interest in behavioral economics. One exciting example of this is the Maxwell X Lab, which Professor Len Lopo and Joe Boskovsky launched out of Maxwell's Center for Policy Research in 2017. The Maxwell X Lab partners with government agencies and nonprofit organizations to design and implement behaviorally informed interventions and rigorous evaluations that are both practical and scalable. One example is their recent work with a community health clinic. The Maxwell X Lab designed a series of communications, or what we might call in the vernacular a series of nudges, that decreased no-show rates by more than 1/2. It's projected to save the clinic approximately $200,000 a year. It's been a great source of learning and will have definite scholarship applications, and we expect many great educational opportunities and outcomes from the X Lab in the years ahead. I'm also very pleased to introduce the Paul Volcker Chair in Behavioral Economics, Maxwell Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs, Len Berman. Len's the inaugural holder of the Volcker Chair and works both with us and as a fellow at the Urban Institute, where he is a co-founder of the Tax Policy Center, a joint project of the Urban Institute and the Brookings Institution. Len embodies the Maxwell tradition of combining the strengths of theory and practice as a thinker, a writer, a teacher, and as a public servant. He exemplifies the many different ways in which one serves the public good and goes beyond government and military service. Throughout his career at the Treasury Department, working with Congress, as well as his time as a teacher at the Maxwell School, Len Berman reflects the values that Bob Menschel intended to honor and foster by establishing the Volcker Chair at Maxwell, values which Mr. Volcker has similarly reflected throughout his lifetime. Maxwell is honored by the generosity and service of Paul Volcker, Bob Menschel, and Len Berman. And so now I'm delighted to introduce the Maxwell School's Paul Volcker Chair of Behavioral Economics, Professor Len Berman.
Thank you, David. I will try not to embarrass Raj with too much praise, but it's hard to overstate the contributions Raj has made and is continuing to make to economics and public policy. Many brilliant economists produce elegant, highly mathematical models that generate revealing and sometimes surprising insights about how economics might work. But they leave the hard work of testing those hypotheses to others. Raj is pretty brilliant himself. He got a PhD from Harvard at age 23, was one of the youngest tenured professors at Harvard in Harvard's history, received the MacArthur Genius Award, won the John Bates Clark Award for the best economist under the age of 40 at age 33. The award said Raj is arguably the best microeconomist of his generation, and he beat out a very strong field for that title. But Raj's research is not abstract. It addresses important problems and changes how we think about them. Questions like, how much is a good teacher worth? And a subject of today's talk, what drives economic mobility and how can we remove barriers? The latest research he's done on that subject drew the attention of former President Barack Obama, who tweeted about it. He's done this work not only through ingenious econometrics, but by assembling amazing data sets. For example, linking together Tennessee education data with income tax returns of students that they filed a couple of decades later, matching census records with income tax return data to study how region, gender, and race affect mobility. This is very hard work. First, he had to convince high-level federal appointees that he could be trusted with very sensitive data, and that it would be worth the trouble to enable Raj and his team to access the data. This requires communications and people skills that not all economists possess. Then he and his team had to clean the data and match it and figure out how to address the various econometric challenges in drawing inferences from non-experimental data. Raj is exceptionally good at this. He is creating data sets that should produce a cornucopia of enormously valuable policy-relevant research, and he is teaching a new generation of economists how to build such data sets and extract their secrets. Raj also has made major contributions to our understanding of behavioral economics. I recommend his Richard T. Ely lecture, Behavioral Economics and Public Policy, A Pragmatic Perspective, which is a guidebook on how to design economic policy to work for humans rather than omniscient, super-rational, optimizing characters of standard economic theory, and how better to predict policy implications in the light of real people. Please join me in welcoming Stanford University Professor of Economics, Raj Chetty.
Thanks so much for the warm introduction, Len, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here at Syracuse. So I'm going to talk today about restoring the American dream. If I can get the slides up here. Just give me one moment. And so I want to start out at a very big picture level by talking about what the American dream is and how it's been evolving over time. So as you all know, the American dream is a complicated concept that means different things to different people. But one way in which it's traditionally been conceptualized is the idea that through hard work, any child in America has the chance of moving up in the income distribution relative to his or her parents. And so I want to start out by assessing the extent to which that's true and whether that remains true today as it has been, the characteristic of America in the past. And so in this chart here, we think about quantifying the American dream in a very simple way, which is to ask what fraction of children earn more than their parents did when we measure their incomes at a comparable age. So what you can see here is on the left, we're looking at kids born in the 1940s, and we're asking what fraction of, if you look at the first dot, what fraction of the children born in 1940 in America earn more than their parents did, measuring their earnings in their mid-30s, accounting for inflation. And you can see that for kids born in the 1940s and 1950s, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of absolute upward income mobility. 92% of children born in America in 1940 earned more than their parents did. If you look at how this has changed over time, there's been a steady and dramatic decline, such that for kids born in the 1980s, it's essentially a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream, a 50-50 shot of doing better than your parents did. Now, this stark trend, I think, in addition to being of economic interest, underlies, in my view, a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, for instance, as in the context of the last election outcome, where you see a particularly steep trend like this. If you look at certain states like the industrial Midwest and look at men in the industrial Midwest, where you see an even sharper decline, you think about the types of people who were saying they felt like they were left behind in the economy. It's exactly this type of phenomenon that I think is very relevant. And so motivated by this trend of what we call the fading American dream, my colleagues and I have been focused on the broad question of how we can restore the American dream of upward mobility and give kids across the United States better chances of succeeding. And so we're doing that in what we're calling the Equality of Opportunity Project, which is an effort to use big data to study how to restore the American dream. So much as you hear a lot about big data being used in the private sector, in Silicon Valley in particular, companies like Google and Amazon using large data sets to improve the products that they offer, our sense, and a lot of your professors here at Syracuse, I think our sense is that using similar data, we can make big strides in understanding important social and economic policy questions. And so what we do in this project is analyze a range of interventions from childhood to adulthood in order to study how to revive the American dream. And the starting point for a lot of our analysis is the fact that there are very sharp differences in children's chances of climbing the income ladder relative to their parents across areas within the United States. So that monolithic national trend that I started out with, turns out the story actually varies a lot across places within America. And so I want to show you that, start to dive into this data here, where in this case we're looking at all kids born in the United States in the early 1980s, a sample of about 10 million children. And we're looking at the geography of upward mobility in the United States. So what this map is doing is taking all kids who grow up in low-income families, so families where parents are earning about $25,000 a year, they're at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. And it's classifying those kids into 740 different metro and rural areas based on where they grow up, and asking for the kids who grow up in each of those areas, what did their earnings in adulthood look like? We track these kids forward about 30 years, measure their incomes around 2010 or 2015 when they're in their mid-30s, and look at that across the United States. The map is colored so that dark green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. Kids have higher earnings there. And the dark red colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. So the first thing I want to do is just draw your attention to the scale here, where you can see that there's a dramatic variation in children's outcomes based on where they grow up. So recall, all of these kids are growing up in families at the same income level. They're growing up in families earning about $25,000 a year. And you can see that for the kids who are growing up in areas in the dark green colors, in the center of the country, for instance, their average incomes, a place like Dubuque, Iowa, for example, their incomes average about $45,000 a year. So really a substantial amount of upward mobility relative to their parents who were earning $25,000. But if you look at the other end of the spectrum, you look at places like Atlanta or Charlotte, you see that kids growing up in those areas are earning something like $25,000, staying on average in the same place as where their parents were, essentially. And so there are really sharp variations across the United States in children's chances of climbing the income ladder. You can see the broad geographic patterns for yourself. In the Southeast, we tend to have much lower rates of upward mobility than we do in the center of the country, part of the coast. You can see Syracuse looks like it's somewhere around the average the United States, where kids are earning about $32,000, the kids who grew up in Syracuse in the 1980s and 1990s. So in this large map, your eye is naturally drawn to this broad regional variation between the Midwest and the Southeast and so forth. But it turns out that when you zoom in more finely, so let's now look at the data in the New York City metro area, for instance, you continue to find quite substantial variation, even at finer geographies. So here you can see at the county level, the same statistics that I showed you on the previous map. What are the earnings of kids who grow up in low-income families? And you can see that even within the New York City metro area, there are really substantial differences. So there are places like Manhattan, for example. So low-income families in Manhattan, they're typically living in a place like Harlem. Those kids are ending up earning about $32,000 on average. But if you go over to Queens, that number jumps to $40,000. So quite a substantial difference for kids growing up a few miles apart, kids who are in the same labor market, and so forth. So naturally, the question that arises when you look at these maps is, why does upward mobility vary so much across areas? That's a question of interest to us as academics to try to understand what's going on in the areas that have lower levels of upward mobility. And it's a question of interest to policymakers to figure out what we might ultimately be able to do in areas that currently don't offer kids good prospects of succeeding. How can we replicate the conditions in the greener areas in the maps throughout the United States? So I'm going to spend most of this lecture trying to answer this question and then ultimately talk about potential policy solutions to address this very important social problem that I think is at the fabric of this country. And as a first step in answering that question, I want to show you a result that most of the variation in upward mobility that I've been documenting in these maps is caused by differences in childhood environment. So there are really two key words in that sentence there. The first is the word caused. That is, it's not just that there are different types of people living in these different places. Of course, the people who live in Atlanta are very different from the people who live in Dubuque or the people who live in San Francisco. But what I'm going to argue is that that's not the reason we're seeing these differences in outcomes across areas. We're going to argue that it's actually largely the causal effect of place. That is, if you take a given child and put that child in Dubuque or in San Francisco, you will see very different outcomes than if that child grew up in Atlanta or in Charlotte. And the second key point is that it's about childhood environment. So you might have thought intuitively that these differences in upward mobility are about differences in the types of jobs that are available in an area, differences in labor market conditions, and so forth. But what we actually find in the data is that what really seems central is conditions during childhood rather than labor market conditions, which, as you can see, will steer you towards certain types of policy solutions. So the way we reach those conclusions is through a set of studies where we analyze the outcomes of 7 million families that move between areas in the United States. And rather than going into the details of the statistical methods here, what I'm going to do is summarize what we find with a simple example. So let's say we take a set of kids who grow up, who initially live in Manhattan, and consistent with the map that I was showing you before, suppose if you grow up from birth in Manhattan, you earn $32,000 on average. That's the average you actually see in the data for kids who grew up in low-income families in Manhattan. So typically a place like Harlem, for instance, for low-income families. And suppose you take a set of kids who move from Manhattan to Queens. And as we saw in the map that I showed you previously, kids who grow up from birth in Queens earn about $40,000 on average in adulthood. So what I want to do now is think about a set of children whose families move from Manhattan to Queens at different ages, starting with children who move when they are exactly 9 years old. So why age 9? That happens to be the earliest age that we can look at in currently available data. So what this point here shows you is when we track these children who move at age 9 and track them forward 21 years and measure their earnings when they are 30 years old, we see that on average, they end up earning something like $36,000. They're about halfway between the kids who grew up in Manhattan from birth and the kids who grew up in Queens from birth. Okay, so that's for the children who moved when they're exactly 9. Now we repeat that analysis looking at children who move when they're 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on. And what you see is a very clear pattern in the data, which is the later you make that move from Manhattan to Queens, the less of a gain you get. If you move by the time you're in your early 20s, you get essentially no gain at all. And if you move after that point, the relationship is completely flat. So I think there are three key takeaways from this analysis. The first is that where you grow up really matters. That is, neighborhoods have a causal effect. It's not just that the people who grew up in Manhattan are different from the people who grew up in Queens. Apparently, if you take a given child and move that child from Manhattan to Queens, you see really different outcomes for that given child. Now, for the econometricians in the audience, you might be wondering, what is the underlying identification assumption behind this analysis? The key assumption we're making here to make that causal inference is that the unobservable determinants of children's outcomes are unrelated to the age at which their family moves from one place to another. So one thing you might worry about is maybe the families who move when their children are young are different from the families who move when their children are older, potentially leading to a biased estimate of this slope. Now, just to give you a flavor for how we're able to address those types of concerns, one thing you can do is compare siblings within the same family. So you can look at a family that moved with a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old, and remarkably, what you find is that the 9-year-old does better than the 13-year-old exactly in proportion to that 4-year age gap, showing you that it can't just be about family-level differences. You continue to see these differences even within families. So based on that evidence and a variety of other evidence that I'm happy to talk more about in the question session, we conclude that it really seems like places have causal effects. That is, where you grow up matters. So I think, to me, that's a really encouraging result because it shows that these kinds of issues are actually changeable. While it might seem like a daunting challenge, how do you actually increase upward mobility for low-income kids? The fact that you're able to move a child to a different nearby area and see such significant changes in their outcomes shows you that this is a tractable problem. The second thing that you see here is that what really seems to matter is childhood environment rather than environment in adulthood. We see in this analysis and other analysis we've done of the moving to opportunity experiment that helping adults move to different neighborhoods does not have any measurable impact on their economic outcomes. What really seems to matter is moving while you're a kid. The third thing you see is that every extra year of exposure to a better area while you're a child has a roughly equal effect on your long-term outcomes. That is, moving to a better area when you're 9 instead of 10, or 13 instead of 14, 15 instead of 16, each extra year seems to build up to a better outcome in the long run. The reason that moving at a very young age is better for you is that you accumulate more years in a better environment, yielding a better, higher earnings in this case, higher rates of college attendance, and so forth. Now that is important, especially in light of current policy discussions about early childhood education, right? So you hear a lot about the importance of intervention at very early ages. What this data shows you is that early intervention may be very valuable. We think it can have incredibly high returns, but there are equally high returns perhaps to intervening at later ages as well. We see that if you move children to better environments, even when they're adolescents, you get similar marginal impacts on their long-term outcomes. And so one of the lessons from this is that we shouldn't be focused solely on early intervention. That may be very valuable, but we should also continue to focus on intervention that improves kids' environments at older ages as well. So that naturally leads to the next question of, okay, so we see that environment matters, we see that we can have impacts on upward mobility, but what does that mean we should do? What are the characteristics of these places that appear to be producing better outcomes for low-income kids? So that's a very difficult question to answer. It's a question we continue to work on in our research group, trying to basically figure out the recipe underlying higher rates of upward mobility in the green-colored areas on the map. What I'm going to do here in the interest of time is summarize a set of correlations that we've identified, the characteristics of areas that tend to have high rates of upward mobility. We've looked at a variety of theories that sociologists and economists have proposed over the years, and we've identified 5 factors that are pretty common characteristics of areas that tend to have high levels of upward mobility. The first is that places with high levels of upward mobility tend to be less residentially segregated by race and by income. Now, there are many different ways in which you can measure segregation from a mathematical perspective. It turns out that the particular index you use actually is not all that important because the patterns here are so stark that you can just see them visually. So let me give you a couple examples. This map here depicts racial segregation in Atlanta. The way it's constructed is using census data. Each person in Atlanta is represented by a dot, and the dots are colored so that whites are blue, blacks are green, Asians are red, and Hispanics are orange. And you can see immediately it's totally obvious that Atlanta is an incredibly segregated city. The whites live in a completely separate part of the city from black individuals. And so corresponding to that, cities that look like this in terms of residential structure tend to have some of the lowest levels of upward mobility in the United States, perhaps because lower income people and minorities are separated from the resources that higher income people have, or perhaps because of a lack of interaction across people from different backgrounds. We don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but this is a very strong pattern in the data that places with high levels of segregation tend to have low levels of upward mobility. If in contrast you look at Sacramento, which actually has the same minority share as Atlanta, the same fraction of blacks and Hispanics as Atlanta, you can see here the colors are much more interspersed. They're not perfectly interspersed, but they're much more interspersed than they were in Atlanta. And corresponding to that, Sacramento and cities that look like this tend to have much higher levels of upward mobility. So that's one strong pattern, that there seems to be some sort of connection, association between segregation and rates of upward mobility. Now, going a bit more quickly through the other key factors we identify, we find that places with a larger middle class, so more people between the 25th and 75th percentile of the national income distribution, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility across generations as well. That is a result of interest because it raises concerns about, as you all know, there's growing inequality in the US. This correlation raises the concern that as we have growing inequality, we might also have less social mobility across generations. We might have less equality of opportunity in some sense. And so that's a reason to potentially be concerned about the growth in inequality, independent of the fact that you have a more unequal income distribution in and of itself. The third strong pattern we find is that places with more stable family structures, that is more kids who grow up in two-parent families, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. That actually, interestingly, turns out to be the single strongest correlation in the data. Now, in interpreting that correlation, an important nuance to keep in mind is that that's not directly driven by whether your own parents are married or not. So you might think intuitively, maybe you see better outcomes in places with more two-parent families because it's better for a given kid to grow up in a two-parent family instead of a single-parent family. But it turns out, even if you look at the set of children who grow up in two-parent families themselves, if they grow up in an area with more single parents, they are less likely to climb the income ladder, showing you that it's not per se about whether your own parents are married or not, but rather, again, some community-level factor that this variable is picking up. The fourth factor is somewhat related to that, is the idea of social capital, popularized in a well-known book by Bob Putnam called Bowling Alone, which some of you have probably heard of. And the idea of social capital, I think of the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child as describing what that concept is supposed to capture. Will someone else help you out even if you're not doing well? And so, consistent with some of the ideas that Putnam put forth in his book, we find that places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of mobility. Now, social capital, it's one of these variables that's notoriously quite difficult to measure. So the reason for the title of Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, is that he used the presence of bowling alleys and whether in particular people were bowling alone as a proxy for social capital. To my amazement, the number of bowling alleys in an area is in fact very highly correlated with these measures of mobility that I'm showing you here. So he seems to have been onto something. The reason I mentioned that to you in this context is it illustrates that everything that I'm showing you on this slide, it's important to emphasize, is a correlation rather than a causal effect, right? So in particular, I would be surprised if the policy solution here is that we should build more bowling alleys to increase upward mobility. So you should think of this more as kind of giving you clues about what seems to matter rather than direct policy recommendations. The fifth factor, where I think there is a stronger evidence base for what the causal mechanisms are, is perhaps, as you might expect intuitively, places that have better public schools, higher quality education, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. And there's a large literature independent of the research that I'm talking about here, which shows that various interventions in schools do have significant causal effects, and I think that's a very important area to think about continued interventions. Okay, so that gives you some sense of why upward mobility varies so much across the United States. Together, these 5 factors explain something like 85% of the variation in the maps that I've been showing you, and I think studying these further can potentially allow us to find ways to increase upward mobility across the country. So now I want to turn to a slightly different set of issues to make sure I don't overstate the importance of neighborhoods and these area level differences. So as I've been emphasizing, socioeconomic class and neighborhood differences matter, but I would caution that they are certainly not the only determinants of economic opportunity. We see substantial differences on other dimensions as well, most notably by race. And so I'm going to talk about a study we just released last week looking at racial differences in economic opportunity that I think really illustrates the importance of these other disparities that we should be paying attention to. And so in this study here, we do analyses similar to what I was showing you before, but look at, break down the data by the race of the child. So this chart here is plotting the income, the household income of children measured around age 35 versus their parents' income percentile. So each dot here represents 1% of the parent income distribution, and we're plotting the average percentile that the child reaches in the children's income distribution at age 35. And we're doing that separately for white kids and black kids. Whites are shown in blue, blacks are shown in red. And what you can see is that across the income distribution, black kids have lower rates, they end up lower in the income distribution than white kids. Different way to put that is they have lower rates of intergenerational mobility than white children across the income distribution. So what I found particularly remarkable about this chart is going into this study, I thought intuitively that race would matter less if you were growing up in a very high income family, but that's absolutely not true. You see that the gap is almost exactly the same, if anything it's slightly larger, among kids growing up in high income families than kids growing up in low income families. Black kids who grow up even among families in the top 1% of the income distribution, who have an average income of $1.1 million a year, black kids end up about 12 percentiles lower in the income distribution than white kids on average. 12 percentiles, that corresponds to an income of roughly $20,000, $25,000, something like that. To give you a more concrete sense of what this means, what that's basically telling you is that black children, even at the top of the income distribution, they have higher rates of downward mobility relative to their parents compared to white children. So just to make that salient, I'm going to turn here to a depiction of these data that the New York Times put together that I think illustrates this particularly well, which shows you these rates of downward mobility. So what they're doing here is blue dots correspond to black boys, orange dots correspond to white boys, and they focus on boys. I'll explain why in a second. You see sharper patterns for boys, and this is, you're tracking 10,000 kids who started out in growing up in high-income families in the top fifth of the income distribution. And look at where the kids end up themselves. You can see that the white kids with pretty high probabilities remain at the top of the income distribution. But you can see the blue dots falling towards the bottom here, ending up in the bottom quintile. And strikingly, black kids actually have a higher chance of ending up in the bottom of the income distribution than they do of remaining in the top. even if they start out in a high-income family. So it's a remarkably high rate of downward mobility. One way you might think about it intuitively is if you think about upward mobility as climbing the income ladder, for black kids, it's almost like you're on a treadmill where every generation you end up falling back even after you've climbed up and out of poverty. And that sharp disparity in rates of intergenerational mobility and rates of downward mobility is what leads, we think, to the persistence of black-white disparities in the United States, okay? So coming back now to what I was showing you here. So this chart is looking at all black and white children. Now it turns out when you dig deeper into these data, and you can see the value of looking at data at this scale, if you break this data down and look at boys versus girls separately, you see really stark gender differences. So this chart here is replicating the analysis we did before, but only using men and measuring their own incomes, their individual income, rather than their household income. So we're excluding your spouse's income in this analysis, okay? And so here you see these really big differences, like what I was showing you before, 10 or 12 percentile point gap between black and white men growing up in families with comparable income. Now, if in contrast you do the exact same analysis for women, you see no gap. In fact, it's actually reversed. Black women have slightly higher incomes than white women, conditional on growing up in families at the same income level. So it's something unique to black boys where you see really different outcomes relative to white men. Now, this is all the more striking when you look at other margins. So this now is looking at employment rates. So this is plotting the fraction of men who are working. Blue, again, is white, red is black. And you can see enormous gaps in the probability of working between white and black men, particularly at the bottom of the income distribution, something like a 20 percentage point difference in the probability that black and white men are employed. In contrast, if you look at women, you see a very different pattern. Black women have slightly higher employment rates than white women, but those two are relatively close to each other. The real outlier here is black men relative to some of the other groups. Women, as is well known from earlier work, even today tend to have lower labor force participation rates than men, so there are gender differences as well, but there are really stark race differences in particular for men. This is most striking when you look at incarceration. So this chart here, again, plots using everybody in the United States born in the early 1980s, the fraction of men who are incarcerated on a single day, the day of the 2010 census, April 1st, 2010. And you can see remarkably, if you look at the first red triangle there, 21% of black men born in the lowest income families are incarcerated on a single day in the United States, which is an amazingly high rate. And it's a very high rate relative to white men in particular. In contrast, if you look at this for women, you know, this is not, it's just not nearly the same sort of issue. And so these kinds of differences by race, you know, I think are extremely important in shaping the nature of upward mobility within the United States. To tie it back to what I was showing you before across, in terms of differences across areas, we can now take the maps that we were drawing before, which pooled all races, and split them up, showing them separately for black men and for white men, putting them on the same scale. Okay, the scale goes from red to green as before. And what is really remarkable and I think quite disturbing here is that you essentially see two Americas. The color scales are essentially non-overlapping on these two maps. So what that's telling you is that the very best places to grow up for black men have outcomes comparable to the very worst places, unfortunately, for white kids. So to give you an example, you know, if you take a place like Boston, where black men have among the best outcomes, relative to other black men, they're earning $24,000 on average if they grow up in a low-income family. In contrast, you know, one of the worst places for upward mobility for white men is Atlanta, and you see average incomes of $26,000 there. So it's like two non-overlapping distributions for black and white men. You see really sharp gaps within each city. So to take an example in Syracuse, 26,000 in terms of your own earnings, individual earnings for white men growing up in Syracuse, only 16,000 for black men. So virtually within every part of the United States, you see these sharp racial disparities that are somewhat orthogonal to neighborhood. So that's why I was emphasizing this is not just about spatial variation. There are large disparities on other dimensions within neighborhoods that are also extremely important to think about, figure out how to address. I think the types of solutions you need have to cut within neighborhoods, within socioeconomic class, by race, targeted in particular at black men, for instance, mentorship programs or reductions in racial bias or some possibilities that people talk about, ways to try to combat these disparities in opportunity. Okay, so motivated by that kind of background evidence, what I want to do in the remaining time is talk about how we can take these types of data and use them to inform public policy to try to actually change, make change on some of these challenges. And so what I'm going to discuss is the way we're thinking about these problems and kind of an analogy to medicine. Think of it as a precision medicine approach to improving opportunity. More broadly, I think this illustrates the direction of research in social science that's feasible thanks to these types of data and modern methods, which is rather than providing sort of one-size-fits-all solutions to questions. So think about a question like, often I'm asked, are charter schools good or bad? So that question does not have a single yes or no answer. When you look at the data, look at the work that other researchers have done, you find that the answer depends greatly upon the context. So which charter schools are you talking about? What are the other alternative public schools that are available? What subgroup of students are you focused on, and so forth? And so very much like in medicine, where it wouldn't really make sense to treat a patient in the same way irrespective of their diagnosis, similarly, I think in economics and in social science, we can start to have tailor-made diagnoses and solutions that actually depend upon the particular challenges an area or an institution faces. And so to illustrate how that works very much in parallel with the medical analogy, I'm going to talk about this in 3 steps. So the first you can think about in the context of diagnosis, identifying where the places are that are in greatest need, so a geographic perspective on diagnosis, then asking what types of policy approaches might be most effective, and then taking a temporal perspective and asking when in a child's life do these disparities arise, so you can figure out what to target. Is it preschool interventions? Is it things at college age? Or things in the labor market, and so forth. So there's one set of issues on diagnosis and trying to figure out exactly what's going on that I think we can do a much better job of with modern data. Then turning to treatment, as you'll see, our vision in what we're doing in our research team in partnership with many others is to work with local stakeholders on designing interventions to address the problems that we've diagnosed, and then eventually evaluate the impacts of what we're doing, disseminate lessons more broadly, and hopefully have a scalable path to increasing upward mobility. More generally, you can imagine this type of approach being applied to a variety of other important economic and social policy questions. So let me illustrate what I mean by this by giving you a couple of examples. So I'm going to start by talking about a project that we're doing with the Seattle Housing Authority, starting with the diagnosis phase, where in our current work, we're drilling down to even finer geographies than what I've been showing you in the previous maps, and looking at how children's prospects of climbing the income ladder vary based on the specific block or census tract in which they grow up. So not at the level of broad metro areas like we were talking about before, but going neighborhood by neighborhood within a city. And so this shows you the data in Seattle, which is where we've started out doing this work. Again, a map colored similarly where red colors represent areas where kids have lower levels of earnings in adulthood, controlling for their parents' income, and green representing areas where kids have better outcomes. And so you can see again, once again, within Seattle, there are quite substantial differences across different neighborhoods. If you're growing up in the central district in a family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, you earn on average $30,000. If you grow up in a place called Del Ridge, which turns out to be a place where a lot of housing voucher holders currently live in Seattle, you earn about $33,000 on average. But if you were to grow up in a place like Normandy Park, further south, kids there earn about $43,000 on average, so they're doing substantially better. So again, at a very local level, you see these really sharp differences, places that are a few miles apart. So what's interesting, in this context then is to say, okay, now we've figured out, there's certain parts of the city coming back here, like the center of Seattle, for instance, where we see low rates of upward mobility. So you can ask, okay, so that's kind of useful from a diagnostic perspective in terms of where we should intervene. But now, what should we actually do about that? So you can think about, I think, at a broad level, two different strategies to try to increase upward mobility when confronted with data like this. And you can think about the question as basically being, do you want to invest in people, or do you want to invest in the places where you currently see low levels of upward mobility? And so that leads to two different routes. One is what you might think of as a choice-based route, where you give people the choice to move to neighborhoods where their kids will have better outcomes, which we've seen based on prior research actually seems to work. Or you can think about a place-based approach of actually investing in the places that are in the red colors on these maps to try to improve outcomes within those areas themselves. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, and I'll start with the choice-based approach. So to think about this choice-based approach, one thing you might wonder about is it really feasible to help families to move to these higher opportunity areas? Aren't those places going to be incredibly expensive, especially in a hot housing market like Seattle? Is it really feasible to help people buy opportunity? And so this chart illustrates the way that we're thinking about that by basically showing you the price of opportunity in Seattle. So each dot here represents a different census tract within Seattle, a different neighborhood within Seattle. And what we're plotting is on the vertical axis, the data that I showed you on the map before, so the average earnings of kids growing up in low-income families. And then on the horizontal axis is the median rent for a two-bedroom apartment in that census tract. And what you can see is probably intuitive, is that there's some upward sloping relationship here. Places that are more expensive, like Bellevue, for example, in Seattle, tend to have better outcomes for kids who grow up there. But importantly, there's a lot of dispersion around this line. And so what that means is you can take a set of families that are living in a place like Del Ridge, which, as I was saying, is a very common area for families receiving housing voucher assistance from the government to currently live. And you can potentially help them move to a place like Normandy Park, which we would think of as an opportunity bargain, a place that is equally affordable to low-income families as Del Ridge, but offers much better outcomes for kids growing up in low-income families. Now, we don't know exactly why Normandy Park has much better outcomes. It could be because of the schools, could be because of social capital, could be because of the different factors that I put up before. Whatever is the case, we have seen from prior work that helping young kids make these sorts of moves actually enables them to do much better later in their lives. And so this is a feasible move for families to make. Now, why is this a particularly attractive thing to do? In the US, we spend about $45 billion a year on various affordable housing programs. But the vast majority of that assistance is used in relatively high poverty, low opportunity areas, places like Del Ridge. And so that creates a significant opportunity to improve kids' outcomes quite substantially without spending more money. And so motivated by that logic, we're doing exactly that, in fact, in collaboration with the Seattle Housing Authority. We're currently piloting a program that we're calling Creating Moves to Opportunity in Seattle, which is a randomized controlled trial where we're offering these families that are clients of the Housing Authority three things: information and financial assistance to make these moves to higher opportunity areas. We're recruiting landlords to participate in this program and rent their apartments to housing voucher holders, where you can imagine landlords might be reluctant to do so if they can rent it to someone else, but we're simplifying the inspection process, giving them an insurance fund, things like that, to make taking housing voucher holders more attractive tenants. And then we're offering brokerage services to help people make these matches and find these units in better areas. And the hope is that this will basically enable more low-income families to take advantage of these opportunity bargains and achieve better outcomes for their kids. So that's one approach, the choice-based approach, which might help some kids climb the income ladder more easily. Now, of course, you might be wondering, like, you can't possibly move everyone, right? That can't be your ultimate solution for increasing upward mobility in the United States. That's just not a scalable solution. I think it's a useful solution to think about nonetheless, because we already spend quite a bit of money on affordable housing, so we might as well spend that money more efficiently. However, ultimately, I think you need to think about place-based solutions. How are you actually going to improve some of the areas that currently have lower levels of upward mobility, change some of the institutions in the United States? And so we are thinking about a range of interventions, and we're doing studies in the context of prenatal care, for instance, home visitation services like the Nurse-Family Partnership. We're doing a set of studies on related to K through 12 schools, improving access to colleges. One can think about interventions in terms of creating more stable family structures and so forth. In the interest of time and given this audience, I'm going to focus on one of these. I'm going to focus on the college access piece to illustrate what some of that work looks like. And so I'm going to show you this data by starting with this chart here, which shows you what the income distribution of parents of students at different colleges in the US looks like. So in another study that we put out about a year ago, we released information on the income distribution of parents and students at every college in America, giving each college basically what we call a mobility report card. How much are you contributing to economic mobility in the United States? And so using that data for the first time, you're able to see the types of kids who are showing up at each college and how they end up doing in adulthood, the two key ingredients that matter for social mobility. So I'm going to start out with my own institution, Stanford, and these bars show you the income distribution of parents of students at Stanford. So you can see that Stanford, as you might have expected, intuitively, tremendously overrepresents kids from higher income backgrounds relative to low income backgrounds. So something like 3% of kids come from the bottom income quintile, something like 65 or 68% of kids come from the top income quintile. Perhaps even more strikingly, 14.5% of kids at Stanford come from the top 1% of the income distribution. The top 1% of the income distribution in this sample, just to give you a sense, the cutoff for that is having an annual income of more than $650,000 a year. So 15% of students at Stanford come from families making more than $650K per year. And so that's typical of other elite private institutions. Harvard, Princeton, Yale all look quite similar. So now let's look at other colleges around the United States. Here's Syracuse, which looks a little bit more representative of the income distribution than Stanford, but not all that much. Also very few low-income kids at Syracuse, like at Stanford. If you look at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, you have a much larger representation of low and middle-income kids at SUNY. And then if you look at the City University of New York, the distribution actually goes the other way, where you have an overrepresentation of kids from low and middle-income backgrounds. So you can see that there's a tremendous amount of variation across colleges in the set of kids who are showing up at each of these places. One statistic that I find useful is often many of us think of college as the place where we're going to mix with people from other backgrounds who we might not have seen in our neighborhoods or in our schools while we were growing up. But strikingly, the level of income segregation across colleges in America is actually exactly the same as the level of segregation across neighborhoods in America, because of this kind of separation that I'm showing you on this chart here. You can look at this data for all 3,000 colleges if you go to our Equality of Opportunity Project website. I'm showing you 4 here as an illustration. Okay, so this is half of the picture that matters for mobility. This is kind of the input, who is going into each college. The other piece that matters is what's happening to kids after they graduate, right? And so what we're then able to do with these data is track all the kids who went to these colleges, everybody in the United States, and look at their earnings when they're in their 30s, similar to what I was showing you before, based on their parental income and which college they went to. So this line here shows you the fraction of kids who end up in the top fifth of the income distribution, first here at Stanford again. So what you can see is that at Stanford, roughly 60 or 65% of kids end up in the top quintile of the income distribution. So that's a very high rate, consistent with the idea that Stanford is selecting some of the top students and hopefully providing some value added to our students. And so you end up with quite good outcomes. One pattern here that I think is striking and quite encouraging is that you see that this line is almost flat. So kids from low-income families who show up at Stanford do almost exactly as well as kids from high-income families. We see that for a variety of outcomes, even beyond earnings. If you look at like the fraction of kids who have patents, for example, you see a very similar pattern. And so why do I say that's encouraging? Because sometimes people worry that if you have more low-income kids at a place like Stanford, maybe that won't actually be such a good thing because they're going to struggle when they come there and maybe not end up doing so well. But in fact, the data seems to suggest they do perfectly fine. In fact, they do just about as well, at least on the things we can measure, as kids from higher income families. So you can similarly look at Syracuse, where you also see very good outcomes relative to the average college in the US. That line is a little bit lower. Again, you see that same pattern, that it's flat across the income distribution. Kids from low income families and high income families at Syracuse do just about as well as each other. So now what you can do is combine these two sets of statistics to construct measures of mobility at each college in America. So let me ask you to focus on two different measures. The first is what I'm going to call access, the fraction of children who come from parents in the bottom quintile of the income distribution, from a low-income family. And the second is what I'm going to call a success rate. What fraction of children reach the top income quintile? So a crude measure of success in the context of earnings. Obviously, many other things matter in the context of success besides earnings, but here's one measure we can construct in thinking about income mobility. Okay, so let's think about access and success rates. At Syracuse, access is 5.7%. That means 5.7% of kids at Syracuse come from families in the bottom fifth of the income distribution. Of those kids, 52% end up reaching the top quintile of the income distribution. Putting those two things together, we can say that Syracuse's mobility rate, that is the fraction of students who came from a family in the bottom quintile and ended up in the top quintile, in some sense, the fraction of kids who achieved the American dream of moving up, is 2.9%. That is 2.9% of kids started out here in a poor family and ended up in the upper middle class or at the top of the income distribution, 2.9 out of 100 kids. Okay, so why does that number seem relatively low? It's because Syracuse has relatively few low-income kids to begin with, right? The fraction of kids who end up reaching the top of the distribution is very high, 52%. But when you're only starting out with 5.7% of kids from the bottom of the income distribution, there's only so much scope you can have to help people rise from the bottom to the top. And so you can then ask, okay, so what are the colleges in America where you have the highest mobility rates? In an accounting sense, what are the colleges where you have the most kids starting out in low-income families and ending up at the top? And so here's a list of the top 10 colleges. And so what you see at the top is Cal State LA, where 10% of kids start out in a low-income family and end up in the top 20%. Stony Brook at 8.4%. The CUNY system as a whole, 7.2%. So some of these places, move a lot of kids, whether it's a causal effect or not, either through value added or through selection, lots of kids are moving from the bottom to the top at these places. If in contrast you look at Syracuse or you look at the Ivy Plus colleges, which is Stanford and the Ivy League and University of Chicago and a couple others, you see much lower rates. And that's because those institutions just don't have that many low-income kids to begin with. So I want to show you one final piece of data, which I think illustrates some of the challenges here and what I think we can potentially do to increase social mobility at our own institutions of higher education. So how have these things changed over time? As you all might know, this kind of thing of access to higher education has been a prominent concern in the United States, in particular at institutions like Stanford, where there were significant expansions of financial aid in the mid-2000s, basically making Stanford free for kids from low and middle income families. So what this is showing you is the fraction of kids who come from low income families with parents in the bottom income quintile by year at Stanford. And what you can see is that this has remained basically flat over the past 10, 15 years or so. There's no big jump in the mid-2000s when financial aid was changed, suggesting that there are other barriers beyond literally having enough money to go to Stanford that might be limiting access. Now let's look at the other colleges we've been focusing on. So this is what it looks like at Syracuse, also relatively flat, maybe a little bit of an increase towards the end. Where you actually see the biggest trends, I think somewhat worryingly, are in places like SUNY and the City University of New York, where you actually have steadily declining access over the past few years. These universities previously catered much more heavily to kids from low and middle income families, and that is gradually, increasingly not the case as you have budget cuts, as you have increases in the number of out-of-state students that these schools take in order to finance themselves and so forth. There are various potential causes. The net consequence of it is that there are about 2/3 as many low-income kids at SUNY today as there were in 2000. And that means, in an accounting sense, that the number of kids that SUNY is moving from the bottom to the top is much smaller now than it was in the past. And so it's this kind of trend, I think, that factors into the initial fading American dream chart that I showed you, where these kinds of trends, where you have less access to higher education institutions that are helping a lot of kids climb the income ladder, potentially leads to lower levels of mobility as well. So what can we do in this context? So a natural thing you might try to do is increase access to the institutions that seem to deliver good outcomes and figure out how to increase value added at colleges more generally. And so just to illustrate, I think, the type of work that's feasible in our research team, we've set up a partnership between our project and about 200 colleges around the United States that are participating in this, where we are linking their internal student data to the data that we work with in an effort to answer two questions. How can we increase low-income access to colleges that help children climb the income ladder, essentially reversing the trends that I was showing you on the previous slide? And second, what types of policies can maximize the success rates of students from disadvantaged backgrounds? So given a set number of low-income kids, how can you increase the value added of the institution? I think by linking these various data sets, you're going to be able to understand exactly which colleges are more effective and what types of policies might be most effective in increasing access. So giving you another example of how, with these data, with modern economic tools, we can have an impact on these important problems. So let me conclude by coming back to the chart that I started out with, the fading American dream. I think one way that you can look at this trend is with disappointment, to be discouraged and say that, America used to be a land of opportunity. It's a place that attracted immigrants like my own parents who came to this country in the search of opportunity. But I think that negative interpretation leaves something on the table. It's not the perspective I have. When I look at these data, I actually think that there's an opportunity and a challenge here. The opportunity is presented by the fact that there are places in America, even today, like Dubuque, for example, or much of the Midwest, where you see really good outcomes for kids growing up in low-income families. And so that demonstrates that it is possible to achieve high levels of upward mobility in the United States. The challenge for us as researchers is to figure out exactly how we replicate those types of conditions across the United States. And I think the challenge for all of us here in the audience is to figure out how to implement these solutions to restore the American dream. Thanks very much.
We have time for some questions, which Raj has generously volunteered to answer. Do we have are people in the back asking questions or collecting them? Oh, and if you have a question, please actually make it a question and not a speech. Is there a microphone? Right there. I've never done this before.
Yeah. The date of when we're measuring kids' locations, or the date of when we're... Yeah, let me just go back to it. This. Yes? Can we bring the slides back up? Is that possible? This.
What date is the data that makes that chart?
Yeah.
What is it based on?
So
Recent?
these are kids born in roughly 1980. We're
Right.
using kids born actually between 78 and 83 here. All children born in America between 78 and 83. We're measuring their income in 2014-15, so that's when they're in their mid-30s. And we're measuring their locations throughout childhood between ages, think of it as basically between ages 0 and 20. And we assign you to a location in proportion to the amount of time you spent growing up in that area. So if you spent half your childhood in New York, half your childhood in Washington, D.C., you're going to be assigned 50% weight in each of those places. That's how it's constructed.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor. I'm just wondering, like, how did you get the data from on the graph?
So the data comes from, all of this comes from tax records, census records, Social Security data held by the US government. This particular map is drawn using tax records that's held by the IRS and Treasury, where we work actually, like Len does as well, as contractors with the government to access that data, de-identified data internally at the Treasury or at the IRS. So that's how it works.
Thank you. What about the data that's about the future, the Syracuse students' future income?
So that's also coming from the same place. So tax records contain information on everyone's income. Interestingly, you know, one of the features of the complexity of the US tax system, one of the benefits of it, I guess, is that the IRS has a lot of information, and one of the things the IRS knows is where everybody in the United States is going to college. And the reason for that is that Syracuse files a form called a 1098-T with the IRS for every student, saying that the student is attending Syracuse and the amount of tuition they paid, which allows you to identify the entire roster of students attending Syracuse and all other colleges in America. And then you can link that to their future earnings, to their parents' income, and so forth internally within the government in order to be able to do those analyses.
Thank you.
Excuse me, sir. What do you find are some of the factors that contributed to declining income mobility or wealth mobility over the past 5 decades?
Yeah.
What do you think has caused that?
Yeah. So I think it's related to some of the factors that I talked about, you know, that explains the cross-sectional variation in the map, those 5 factors. So the US is an increasingly segregated country residentially. There are some people who would argue that there's less social capital now than there was in the past. There's certainly more inequality now than there was in the past, and mechanically that's actually driving some of the fading American dream pattern that I was showing you. So if you think about kids earning more than their parents, the fact that the median wage in the United States has basically remained unchanged over the past 30 years or so, all of the gains have gone to the very top, means that fewer kids are earning more than their parents did than in the past, where we had broad-based income growth. So I think a lot of the factors that matter in explaining the spatial variation also factor into what's driving that declining trend.
All right, and my follow-up is, what do you think might be some specific policy changes, whether for the United States as a whole or for a regional basis, that could be implemented to reverse some of these trends?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the key question. So as I was trying to indicate at the end, one approach is helping families move to higher opportunity areas. As you can see, we're trying to implement that. That can have some impact on some scale. I think increasing access to higher education institutions that have good outcomes can have significant impacts. I think figuring out how to make investments in communities that currently have weaker schools, for example, changes in the K-12 education system, for instance, trying to retain and recruit better teachers in K-12 schools in the US, I think can have big impacts. I also think on some dimensions, like the racial dimension, it's very important to think about programs that go beyond kind of the traditional, let's reduce segregation, let's try to improve schools, because we see that black and white kids who grow up on the same block in families with the same parent income, same structure, end up having really different outcomes. That suggests you need to be doing something more than that, creating more meaningful racial integration within schools, perhaps having programs that offer better role models or pathways to success for black boys in particular, and so forth.
Thank you, sir.
Hello. Do you know whether data exists to reveal the impact of organizations like the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Boys Clubs, Girls Clubs, and the like, voluntary organizations?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question. I think studying that more carefully would be very useful. I have a former student at Harvard, who is studying the impacts of Big Brother, Big Sister programs. It's kind of in that vein by linking that data to the type of data we're using here. And while it's too early to have conclusive results, there's some indication that kids who got to participate in those types of programs have better outcomes. Again, my guess is the devil is in the details. That is, it's going to be difficult to come up with a blanket answer to yes, Boy Scout programs work or they don't. I think my guess is it's going to depend greatly on what exactly is happening in different Boy Scout programs, who you're paired with in a Big Brother, Big Sister program, and so forth. But by learning about the details of those mechanisms, we might be able to come up with more scalable solutions.
Can you suggest data models that they might accumulate that they could use to report this?
Yeah, I mean, what would be very useful is if those types of programs kept track of the students who participated in those programs, and also students who applied for those programs but didn't get in, because then you have a comparison group, and then you can potentially link those data to these types of data sets without having to, do very costly surveys that can be difficult to implement. So I think keeping track of that kind of information is really valuable.
So I've read a lot of studies that conclude that first-generation Americans tend to have a greater level of upward mobility than their American-born peers. So I was just wondering if your study and your data also saw a correlation between that.
Yeah, and you absolutely see that. And you see that in particular in this recent paper, we show some data for Asians, for instance, who seem to have much higher rates of upward mobility than all the other groups. But that turns out to be entirely driven by first-generation immigrants. If you leave out immigrants, Asians have very similar outcomes to white Americans in terms of intergenerational mobility. So that's important because there's a literature that's kind of developed around the idea that Asians might be a model minority in terms of having relatively exceptional outcomes, but that appears to be essentially an immigrant phenomenon. It's not actually something that's true of Asian natives. And so you're absolutely right that it's important to distinguish the outcomes of immigrants from others. What might be going on with immigrants? So one example is you hear about very highly qualified immigrant parents who end up taking lower paying jobs in the US because they're not able to work as an engineer or whatever they were doing in their home country. And so then that's going to make it look like those groups have very high levels of upward mobility in the data because parents are extremely qualified. So in some sense, they truly have very high income and very high skills. But in the data, it looks like they have low levels of income, and that pushes up their observed levels of upward mobility. So I think there are big differences between immigrant and non-immigrant groups.
Hello. Thanks for coming. With mindful of the time we have, would you mind speaking to your K through 12 education policy recommendations?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's so many things one can do in the K through 12 space that I think can have an impact. What we've seen from our own studies is that interventions, even the earliest years, having a better kindergarten teacher, for example, can have quite substantial impacts on kids' long-term outcomes, on their earnings, college attendance rates, and so forth. So that would suggest that trying to improve the quality of the teaching workforce can be quite valuable. How might you go about doing that? Part of it could be giving schools, principals more flexibility to retain better teachers. Right now, as you might know, pay is set in schools typically in lockstep with experience. There's very little capacity to give bonuses to teachers who are really excelling, who you want to retain. There's limited capacity to replace teachers who aren't doing as well in the classroom. So I think that set of issues can be quite important. I think in another domain, there are certain types of schools that are much more effective than others. There's good work by Parag Pathak and Josh Angrist at MIT showing the impacts of certain types of charter schools that seem much more effective than other types of charters, than certain public schools. So trying to encourage the growth of schools that are delivering good outcomes, I think, is a useful thing to do. The third kind of broad thing I would note is we tend to focus in education on traditional outcomes like performance on standardized tests. And while I think those can be useful indicators and they're easy to measure well, what we actually seem to find is what's much more important are so-called non-cognitive skills, like your ability to get along with others, discipline, focus, rather than, how good are you at trigonometry. And I think that's because those other skills often end up being more relevant in the labor market for a lot of people. And so figuring out how to measure those skills better and create environments that develop those skills more effectively is something we should be paying attention to.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the lecture. I have a question about your data for college access, because I was thinking mathematically you can only have like 20% of people who end up in the top quintile of income, and mathematically you can only have 20% in the starting off from the lowest quintile. Yeah. So when we see the elite institutions having the access rate actually improving a little bit and public universities dropping, is it that in total it's balancing out each other, or is it that in total actually the aggregated access rate is dropping, or like what's the trend there?
Yeah, so the aggregate access rate I would say is, so the absolute number of low-income kids going to college is going up slightly over time. The number of higher income kids going to college, at least in the period that we were looking at, was going up more. So if you think about access as the fraction of kids going to college who are from low income families, it's not changed a ton. But what really matters, I think, is the allocation of kids to colleges, right? So just having more kids go to college may or may not lead to desirable outcomes depending upon which colleges they're going to. If you have more low-income kids going to colleges that produce really good outcomes, then you're going to have more mobility. And what I was trying to show there is among some of these colleges that have very good outcomes, like Syracuse or Stanford, you don't see really substantial changes in access there. Where you see much bigger changes are in other colleges that also have very good outcomes, like Stony Brook or CUNY, which is worrisome because those kids end up potentially going to other local community colleges and so forth, some of which might be quite good, but others don't have as good outcomes, and then that's what ends up leading to lower levels of mobility. So I think access is very important, but in addition to access, we need to be thinking about the outcomes of kids, which involves things like completion rates, what's the value added of the college, and so forth. And so I think that's an important area to focus on.
Sorry, just to clarify, so it means that in total the mobility rate is also dropping?
Yes, the mobility rate is dropping. Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
My question is related to data. So now that you've done kind of the grunt work of banging down the door at Census, trying to get these things linked and get access to them, do you see trends in these federal agencies expanding the role of the use of these types of data sets for other researchers? And do you have any concerns that access to that becomes kind of a marker of a winner-take-all job market in economics or other fields?
Yeah, so access to these kinds of data is, I think, crucial now to make progress in studying these questions. And our hope is in setting up these databases and this infrastructure, there will be more and more people who can use these data. So the work we had done previously at IRS and Treasury has very much gone in that way, where there are now 140 researchers who've written papers with the tax data, not the census version of it, but the tax data held by Treasury and IRS. And so that is expanding. It's never going to be, you don't want it to be kind of publicly available on the web, but I think through appropriate protocols, more and more people are able to get access. And likewise, we're hoping to set up a similar infrastructure at Census, so there will be broader-based access. I think a challenge for graduate students in particular is getting access to these data sets in a time frame that's really feasible for a dissertation. And one of the things that I think is valuable for students to think about is how to plug into other research teams that might be working on a project. There are researchers at universities across the US, including here at Syracuse with Len and others, working with these types of data. And so I think one of the other trends you will see over time is more and more people working on teams, because I think working at the scale often requires a lot of people to kind of collaborate.
Hi, my question's also regarding your data. There was one particular slide where you compared the incomes over time of individuals or students that came from the lower quintile of their parents' income bracket to those in the higher quintile. So that slide seemed encouraging, right? Those that were able to attend these more expensive colleges tended to earn more money over time. My question is, was that comparing just college graduates? Because my concern would be that there are individuals that gain access to these colleges but then do not graduate.
So that's actually everybody who attends.
Okay.
We don't condition on those who graduate for exactly that reason.
Okay.
My guess is if you were to condition on those who graduate, at some of these colleges like Stanford and Syracuse, completion rates are high enough that I think that's not a first order issue. At community colleges, it's a huge deal. And certainly if you start to look at community colleges, two-year colleges, you start to see more of a slope. And I think that is driven by rates of completion. But at the elite colleges where you have pretty high completion rates, that's where we're taking everybody who attends.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
First of all, being able to assemble and correlate these data sets is an amazing accomplishment and very, very impressive. However, the presentation doesn't make any distinguishing about utility. Obviously, the utility of upward mobility for someone in the first quintile of income is a great deal different than the utility for someone at the top. And so with the curves, don't really give any insight as to what, I guess I'm struck with the question of whether the analysis we're looking at is a function of your ability to access and correlate this data, or some value to upward mobility per se that I don't recognize.
So it's a good question. I mean, we're explicitly not putting, a normative framework as a different way to say what you're saying, weighing these different gains in utility terms. We're taking a very empirical approach of just trying to document what these patterns are and what the drivers are of upward mobility, partly because we think for various reasons there's a lot of interest in increasing opportunities for upward mobility for low-income families. I think motivated by the kind of reason you're describing, that people think that there's a greater weight placed on rising up if you're starting out at the bottom than if you're already at the top, kind of a diminishing marginal utility sort of view. But independent of that, done some other work suggesting that greater social mobility might also be valuable for increasing economic growth, because you get more kids doing things like innovating, becoming inventors that then might contribute to greater aggregate economic growth. But to answer your question, I think there's value in understanding first, just in describing the patterns that we see in the data. So for instance, racial disparities in opportunity and so forth, to understand the challenges that we face. But then taking as given that, society, for whatever reason, policymakers, the public, values having greater social mobility. Okay, so let's now figure out what the drivers of social mobility are and what we might be able to do to change that. Now, that's not to say that I don't think the normative work of trying to think about how this affects utility, how to weigh these different gains, I certainly think that that's very valuable as well. But I think that type of analysis can be done better if informed by these sorts of data.
Thank you.
Thank you for excellent talk. Actually, my questions I think answered by you just now. My question was, if we increase the upward mobility, how would it impact the overall GDP growth of our country? And also how would it impact the downward mobility for other people? I think you briefly explained that. But maybe I can also ask another question. Sure. Did you consider regional inflation rate differences, or did you use the overall US inflation rate? Or did you consider different industries in the United States by location and tax rates collected by those kind of other independent variables? Thank you.
Yeah, so let me take each of those in turn. So inflation, you might think intuitively, is this map, for example, going to look really different if we accounted for differences in local cost of living between New York City and other places and so forth? So it turns out actually, first empirically, if you were to use real measures of income where you deflate income by local price indices, you get a very similar map, correlated 0.91 with this map that I'm showing you here. So why is that intuitively? It's because upward mobility is fundamentally about the difference between kids' and parents' incomes, and most kids tend to live near where their parents did or broadly in a similar area. And so it's true that kids in New York City, if you were to use real income measures, they would look like they're lower in the income distribution, but so would their parents. And so as a result, upward mobility ends up being not that sensitive in practice to these cost of living adjustments. Now, the other factors you mentioned, did we correlate with measures of industrial structure? Yes, you don't find that much of a pattern, actually. That's consistent with the result I was showing you, that it's mostly about childhood environment rather than differences in the labor market in adulthood. Differences in tax rates, you can kind of see from looking at the map, right? It's not obvious. There's no kind of obvious political split or progressive, conservative kind of split. And so you don't end up finding that much in terms of a correlation with tax rates. All of that I would caveat by saying, those are correlations. What's the causal effect of increasing taxes, of course, is a separate issue, deserves further study.
Hi, so I also have a database question, and I'm wondering, so when you're using this research to make place-based, location-based decisions, how do you account for the changing characteristics of cities over time? So for example, you talked about Manhattan demonstrating less upward mobility than Queens, but it also seems to me that there might be differences between the Manhattan of today versus the Manhattan of the 1980s, which is what the upward mobility data is based off of.
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges here. So intrinsically, you can't measure upward mobility if you're going to look at kids' earnings for kids who are growing up today, right? Because you're going to have to wait 15, 20 years to see their outcomes. And so two things we've done on that. So the first thing you might think about doing is to use intermediate indicators of later outcomes. So for instance, test scores in childhood. So you can ask, do the places that seem good in terms of upward mobility, are we also seeing good outcomes for kids currently growing up in terms of, say, like their 5th grade test scores or something? And, that can give you some way to pick up neighborhood change, and it's something that we're pursuing. For example, in the Seattle example I was showing you, where we're actually helping families move to different areas, we verify that the places that we identify as higher upward mobility, even today, if we look at more recent indicators like test scores, have similar patterns. But the second thing to say is that overall, when you look at the data, there's actually quite a bit more stability than you might think. You can certainly think of examples of parts of New York that have changed dramatically, for example. But by and large, if you kind of look at the big picture, the places that were good 15, 20 years ago tend to be the places that are good today. So I think of this more as a predictor. It's not an exact measure of what's going to happen to kids growing up today because you're never going to be able to measure that perfectly. It's unknowable until they actually grow up. So the way I look at it is like a prediction problem. What's my best guess? And what we found is your best guess, if you were to run a regression, often puts most of the weight on this historical data and some of it, very little of it, on these intermediate indicators like test scores, largely because these patterns seem pretty stable over the period we're able to look at.
Hi.
This is going to be the last question.
I'm wondering if you've looked at any of the trends as you get further away from the average, like if there are any exceptions that have, if there's been exceptional mobility on someone where that's very different from the average, if that's been anything noticeable or worth looking into.
So do you mean exceptions in terms of areas or in terms of parts of the income distribution?
Parts of the income distribution.
So do you mean are there certain kids who are especially likely to reach the very top or grow up?
Yeah, or in terms of looking at kids that maybe started out, since they're all starting from the same place, for the ones that saw the biggest jumps, like what traits might be standing out with the biggest jumps or things like that.
I see. Which types of kids had the biggest jumps, right? I mean, what we've looked at is, looked for systematic variation across areas, across the types of schools these kids go to, and so forth. And what you can see is there are some systematic patterns, right? The kids who are rising up, they tend to grow up in certain types of neighborhoods. There are systematic patterns by race, and so forth. But it's true that, there's an enormous amount of unexplained variation in the data. So there are lots of kids, even within these cities, which we're classifying as low upward mobility or census tracts that are low upward mobility, who end up doing quite well. We're just showing you the means here. And so I think it would be really useful to have additional sources of information, both qualitative and quantitative, to understand what's the story behind those outliers, because that might give us additional hypotheses to test. So there's certainly a lot more there, and I think that's a good note to end on, a lot more for people here to study.
Thank you so much. There will be a reception after this in the back. Thank everybody for coming, and thank you.